Hey everybody, welcome to Capturing Christianity. Today we're hosting a dialogue. We actually haven't had a dialogue or a debate. This is more of a dialogue, but we haven't hosted one of these in a long time, so I'm really excited about today. But we've got Dr. Tyler McNabb and Dr. John Wathey, who's joining me to talk about whether or not science undermines belief, or Christian belief in particular. So Dr. Wathey, we'll turn it over to him in just a moment and get some more information about him and the reason why I've invited him to discuss this topic on the show today. But before we do that, I actually want to let you know about a fundraiser that we currently have going on for new patrons that sign up on Capturing Christianity. There's only 6 days left, but every $10 patron that signs up gets this beanie. This is in addition to everything that you get over on patreon.com/Capturing Christianity. You're going to get this beanie. We're going to ship it directly to your house. That's at the $10 amount. If you'd like to sign up at the $25 amount, we actually have this shirt. We're going to send you the shirt and the beanie at the $25 amount. You can kind of see it there. And then the last thing that we do is if you sign up at the $50 per month amount, as an added thank you, we're going to send you this mug. Let's see if we can get the camera to focus on it here. By the way, Christianity is true. These are all custom handmade. Both Brittany and I make these by hand, each one of them. We're going to send these out, the beanie and the shirt and the mug. If you sign up at the $50 amount on Patreon, you're going to get all three. Again, this is a fundraiser we currently have going on. There's 6 days left. So if you'd like to sign up on Patreon, support Capturing Christianity, help us work through a deficit that we currently have in giving, then yeah, if you can do that, and if you'd like to get some of these things in return, and all the stuff that like I mentioned on Patreon that's already there, you're going to get that as well. So this is just sort of an added thank you for your support of Capturing Christianity. With that, let's go ahead and get into the dialogue. Let's welcome our two guests. First of all, let's welcome Dr. Tyler McNabb back on the show. And well, let's turn over to you, Tyler. So thanks for coming back. It's awesome to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, man. It's great to be back and to do one of these things, not in like China time. To do this, in the middle of the day instead of the middle of the night. So yeah, it's great to be back. Thanks.
Yeah. And then Dr. John Wathey is his first time on the show. I actually heard about you for the first time. I think it was only about a month ago that you appeared on Myth Vision with Derek. Is that right? It was about a month ago?
Yeah, actually I did 2 interviews with him, one in September and one in October.
Okay. And each interview was on a different one of your books?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. So the 2 books that you've got are The Phantom God and excuse me, The Illusion of God's Presence. And when you were presenting, I thought that it was a very clear presentation, and I just thought that it would be fun to have a dialogue with you and another Christian epistemologist, someone who's been thinking about these similar issues. So the way that the structure is going to go today for the dialogue is we're going to do 10-minute openings for each person, so that way they can kind of spell out what their views are. And then after that, we're just going to go directly into a kind of moderated dialogue where I'll be interrupting as minimally as possible. So if things kind of get stagnant or if I need to move things along, I'll jump in. But the hope is that I won't be doing any of that. I'll just let them talk and kind of sit back and actually enjoy the conversation myself. And then after that, so we're going to do a conversation for about, I think, 45 minutes or so. And then we'll do some Q&A with the audience toward the end. So with that, though, because this is Dr. Wathey's first time on the show, I'd like to give him 60 seconds, not part of his 10-minute opening statement, but I'd like to give him some time just to talk about himself and maybe mention some more things in his books. And that way you can learn a little bit more about him before we get started.
Okay, sure. I should say that I was a Christian myself once for about 10 years. It's a little hard to say exactly when I started being a Christian in that period, but I was going to church with my father from about age 4 to age 15. And when I got old enough that I could sort of start thinking for myself in adolescence, I began to see serious problems with Christian theology. It just could not be true in my thinking, in my perception. I noticed serious problems and confronted my father about that, and started down a path to free thinking. And ironically, I actually attribute some of that to my father because he was a scientist himself. My worldview now is a scientific one. I'm a I could call myself a humanist, a skeptic, an atheist, an agnostic, a free thinker. All of those apply to me, but probably free thinker is the thing I most identify with. I think it's important to not have any constraints on where you allow yourself to go in pursuit of the truth, if truth really is the thing you care most about. I did my PhD in a lab that studied what's called neuroethology, and I'll talk about that in my opening statement some more, so I probably won't go into it here. So that's kind of a quick summary of where I'm coming from.
And you've got two books that you've written on the subject that we're talking about today, and you've also got a website. So let everyone know what the name of the website is, so that way they can find out more.
The website is watheyresearch.com. And I should apologize in advance because I haven't yet updated the website to fully describe my new book. Right now it's mostly about my first book, but I'm going to get to that soon, I hope. It's just been very frantic getting the second book off the ground. I haven't had time
no problem.
to do that yet.
All right, well, now let's just go ahead and jump into opening statements. So, Dr. Wathey, we'll start with you. And by the way, let's just use first names if that's cool with everyone. I'll just call you your name. I mean, you go by John, and that's important because that's what you have on the title of your books and everything. So, he is John Wathey, but he goes by Jack, as I understand it. And so we'll refer to him as Jack. We'll refer to Tyler as Tyler for the show today. So, Jack, when you're ready, go ahead and begin. And I do have the two slides. When you're ready, I'll just let me know. I'll pull them up, and that way everyone watching can see them. Okay,
great. Well, as I was saying, I did my PhD in a lab at UC San Diego. It's in the Department of Neurosciences. But my professor was Ted Bullock, who's well regarded as one of the founding fathers of what's called neuroethology. And to explain what that is, I have to say a little about what ethology is without the neuro part. Ethology is the study of animal behavior in its natural context. And ethologists are interested in the selective pressures that give rise to the behavior and how it contributes to an animal's reproductive success. So good examples are the early work of Konrad Lorenz on imprinting in birds, Nico Tinbergen's studies of feeding and interacting with parents in the herring gull chicks, things like that. Now, when you put neuro in front of it, what it refers to is a special approach to trying to understand the brain, which has to do with the idea that the brain is so complicated, so unfathomable when you first approach it, that it just seems hopeless until you try this strategy, which is to look at some limited part of the brain where you know exactly what that circuit is trying to do. You know exactly what problem it's trying to solve. And we can best do that in an animal that is highly specialized for a very unique, well-developed behavior. So, for example, things like the ability of barn owls to hunt in total darkness using only sound cues, or the way weakly electric fish can navigate and communicate with one another with electric fields. Those are good examples of classic neuroethology studies. So that's kind of where I come from scientifically. And a good example of when I was, this was in the mid 1980s, so I had long since split with religion myself, but I thought of where religion comes from and worried about that, and I started to see human religiousness through this lens of neuroethology, especially the infantile dimension of religiousness, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Freud first called attention to it, but religious people tend to think of themselves as children of God, and God as an exalted parent figure, and so on. So there's this very strong, it's not the whole of religion, but there's a very strong strain of infantile imagery in religion. So that's what I concentrated on, and that was partly because ethologists tended to concentrate on the behaviors of newly hatched or newly born animals. because those behaviors, you can be pretty confident, are completely innate. They're not a product of learning. Their evolution has completely shaped behaviors like that. And a great example are the behaviors of herring gull chicks when they first hatch out. They have an innate visual model of their parent's head and bill, and they know that it's a long, skinny thing with a little red spot on the tip, and they peck at that spot to solicit feeding. So I started to see religiousness through that lens, and especially what's often called the feeling of God's presence, or I would call it, as I did in the title of my book, the illusion of God's presence. Now, since we're addressing a Christian audience here, I'm sure many of you have had this experience. But just for a few who may not have, I'd like to read a couple of examples from my book. This one comes from Alistair Hardy, who is a marine biologist. From very early days, I was a keen natural observer, and when out in the country, on walks by myself, looking for beetles and butterflies, I would sometimes feel a presence which seemed partly outside myself and, curiously, partly within myself. My God was never an old gentleman out there, but nevertheless was like a person I could talk to, and in a loving prayer could thank him for the glories of nature that he let me experience. So that's a classic example, I think, of the kind of experience we're talking about here. There's another variety that tends to come on only transiently and suddenly and in times of great emotional crisis and stress or helplessness. So I came up with a hypothesis to try to explain these feelings. Through my background in neuroethology, I thought that this is something that we can explain scientifically, that I saw this as a completely natural phenomenon. So here's the hypothesis I came up with, and again, I'll just read it from my book, if you'll permit me. A newborn infant has an innate neural model of its mother. This is not a detailed image of a specific person, but only a sense of the existence of some vague and amorphous primordial savior out there somewhere. Specifically, a newborn human infant knows that its mother exists, that she knows how to help the infant, is able to help, wants to help, and will help when she hears crying. Now, there's a bit more to it than that. Of course, there's some physiologically important information about the mother providing nourishment, about her having a face, and some rough idea of what a face is and what it looks like. Now, the circuitry that implements this innate model of the mother persists into adulthood, but normally lies dormant. And again, this is a hypothesis. I'm just proposing this idea. And finally, I suggest that the existence of this circuitry in the adult can give rise to the illusory feeling of a loving presence, especially, though not necessarily, under conditions that mimic the helplessness of infancy. And these feelings are often interpreted in religious terms because a crude mother-shaped vacuum is easily misperceived as a God-shaped vacuum. So that's the essential idea. And I want to also add that this feeling of a sensed presence often comes with an uncanny feeling of knowing or sense of certainty that gives the person experiencing it a compelling belief, almost a sense of certainty, a kind of knowing, an intuitive knowing that the being whose presence is felt really exists. It's a truly overwhelming sense of knowing. And having said that, I also want to raise some alarm bells or a warning flag. And if you could put up the image number 1, I'll show you what I mean by that. Perception comes not only from sensory input, but also from what the brain expects. We have a tendency to see things that are not there. And there's a word for that, pareidolia. I'm sure you've all experienced it. We see faces in the clouds. odd shapes in the sky and rocks and random stimuli. And the one I'm showing here is a very famous one from 1976. This is an image of Mars from the Viking 1 orbiter. And by now you've all probably noticed a prominent face right in the middle of this image. It's an ambiguously shaped mesa where the shadows just happen to fall on it in a way that it just compels interpretation as a human-like face. Now, when this was first seen, it actually created a lot of attention in the press, and some people even went so far as to believe that there was an ancient civilization on Mars with humanoid people, and they had made this sculpture on Mars for people like us on Earth to see. But of course, what's really happening here is that the brain is filling in missing information, and we can get an appreciation for that from the second image, if you'll put that up. This is the same mesa photographed years later at much higher resolution by the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. And you can see here, and I've still got a little inset down in the corner where you can compare it to the old image from 1976. And the lighting is a little different here, but the main point is that at high resolution, it's obvious that this face exists only in our brains, not on the surface of Mars. And the fundamental reason that the brain works this way, the reason we have this kind of illusion, is that our intuition is aimed at reproductive success, not truth-finding. That, I think, will be an important point in our discussion today. And that is the extent of my opening statement.
All right. Is it good for me to go?
Oh, sorry about that. I had my my microphone muted. I was just saying that it was 9:43, so that was great timing. All right, so Tyler, yeah, take it away whenever you're ready. I'll start my timer.
All right. Well, thanks, Jack, for talking. It's an honor to meet you and talk with you, and hopefully we'll have a really fun discussion today. So does science undermine Christian belief or religious belief? One could plausibly interpret this question as something like, maybe it's saying something like, does science provide us with defeaters for thinking that our religious belief is true? Right? Obviously, this would be kind of very much in line with sort of an epistemic glossing of the debate today. So I want to start off first with talking about a couple of different epistemic theories that I think will help us in our discussion and whether or not science acts as a defeater for religious belief. Epistemologists are after, oftentimes, a concept called justification. You can understand justification in lots of different ways. You can understand it to be interchangeable with what we'll call warrant, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. We can understand it to just be talking about this truth-conducive property. I'm going to understand it primarily deontologically. So I'm going to understand justification to be some sort of term with respect to if we are within our rights in believing a proposition, or if we are believing irresponsibly, right? We're not within our rights. Well, there's lots of different theories about justification. One very popular theory right now is called phenomenal conservatism. And roughly, it says that S's belief that P is justified, or S has some justification for a belief that P, if it seems to S that P, and S is without a defeater for her belief that P. Put in simple terms, if I just walk into a room and see lots of different people, right? If it seems to me that there are lots of people in front of me, and I have no defeater for thinking that these people aren't in front of me, then I have some justification for believing that there are people in front of me, right? So a defeater, what would that look like? Maybe someone all of a sudden comes in and pushes a button and turns everyone's head sort of shuts down, and their heads open up, and you can see that everyone actually is just like well-designed Westworld robots, right? So if it seems to you to be the case that something is the case, and you don't have any defeaters for that belief, then you have some justification for believing it. Obviously, our seemings can betray us, right? a stick in water, or you're on a hot summer day in Houston, and you might see some water on the road, right? It doesn't seem like our planet is spinning at any sort of ridiculous rate, right? Obviously our seemings can be flawed, right? Our seemings can lead us to false beliefs. But the idea is that until you have really good evidence that your seeming is misplaced, so to speak, then you have some justification, right? Another theory that I like, that I've defended in the literature, is called proper functionalism. Proper functionalism is a theory about warrant. Warrant is supposed to be the special ingredient that turns mere true belief into knowledge. So you can have a true belief, for example, but yet not know something. I could believe that the Rockets are going to win the rest of their games for the season and go and win the NBA championship, winning every game 100-50. Even if that somehow happened, few people would want to say, I knew that, right? I knew that was going to happen, even if I believed it. So warrant is supposed to be the ingredient that actually turns true belief into knowledge. And so this is a really cool ingredient. I want all my beliefs to have warrant. How do my beliefs possess warrant? Well, proper functionalists, and there are well-known naturalists as well as theists who are proper functionalists, they'll say that S's belief that P is warranted if and only if S's belief that P is produced by properly functioning cognitive faculties, which are an environment for which they're designed. The cognitive faculties have a design plan, even given by God or evolution or both, that's aimed at production of true belief, and there's a high statistical probability that the belief being produced under such conditions will be true. Put again in more simpler terms, right? If I walk into a room and I see an audience full of people, right, and I just form a belief, like an immediate belief, an unreflected belief, just an immediate belief that there are other people in this room, that belief would be warranted if it is indeed the product of my cognitive modules, my cognitive faculties working properly, and in this case, they are aimed at truth successfully so. So in this case, we can talk about religion, right? It might just seem to you that God exists. Perhaps you're looking up at the starry sky and you're seeing the waves of, maybe you're at an ocean, the waves are crashing upon the rocks, and you're looking up at the starry sky, and you just find yourself in awe. You find yourself believe that God created this, or that maybe God is very powerful. Or if you're a proper functionalist, maybe you think you're designed to produce the belief that God exists in this sort of environment, right? And so if you find yourself believing that God created this, and your faculty, that's the result of your cognitive faculties working properly and successfully aimed at truth, then once again, your belief would have warrant. And this could be even for specific beliefs like Christianity. By Christianity, of course, I mean something like the Nicene Creed. At the heart of it being that the second person of the Trinity came and died for our sins and rose again, and in doing so, we have forgiveness and the reconciliation of the cosmos. That even beliefs like this can be warranted, even apart from argumentation. And we could talk about how that could be the case, but it might just be that it seems to you that Christianity is true, or maybe you're accepting a testimony, and you find yourself thinking that the testimony is true when you hear it, and your acceptance of that testimony is the result of, say, the proper functionalist conditions being in place, then your belief would be warranted. In the same way that my child can know that in 1492 Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, is in the same way I can know that, say, that Christ, for God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever shall believe in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. So I think that both on phenomenal conservatism or on proper functionalism, we could talk about how religious belief can be rational, how it can be justified, how it can be possess positive epistemic status, how it can be warranted. Now, specifically for Jack's model that he offered, this sort of attachment theory, or maybe attachment theory plus various kind of evolutionary psychology modules coming into play. Yeah, so I'm totally fine in conceding all what Jack said. Personally, I'm more sympathetic. I am a kind of a pluralist about this in reference to lots of modules are probably at work in us that are responsible for producing belief in God. I'm more sympathetic to the kind of general picture. So for those who are watching, don't know, in cognitive science of religion, the paradigm view is that religious belief is an evolutionary spandrel, right? I'm inclined to kind of the generic story that people like Justin Barrett tell, where um, uh, we have the hyper agency detection device. Generally, it's reliable in detecting agents, but sometimes it's a little too hyper. It's a little too sensitive, and it detects false positives, like Jack brought up in his Mars analysis. And plus, you throw in a theory of mind with having a hyper agency detection device. Well, then we have some sort of explanatory story for maybe why you find yourself believing that God created the starry skies when you look and you find yourself in all of transcendence. But I'm totally fine with thinking that some sort of attachment theory plays a role in mediating or forming our beliefs about God. A little skeptical that it has the resources to produce the concept of God itself, right? But definitely fine with it mediating. I think people like Justin Barrett would probably be a little skeptical of that as well. But for argument's sake, we can just say, fine, Jack is right. This is generally how people come to believe in God, right? Freud is right. It vindicates Freud. We do believe in God to keep us safe. We need some sort of cosmic daddy figure to keep us safe in this dark and cold world, right? And so I think Jack's analysis is great. He makes Freud's point more plausible, and I think Jack should be commended on that. That I enjoy thinking of his theory. I think ultimately it gives meat to the bones of Freud. Right. So how to think about this? Well, it seems to me that, again, if God exists, and notice I'm saying if, it's a conditional statement, if God exists, and he's designed our cognitive faculties, he's given this sort of module, this sort of attachment module, as Jack has described it, to not only let us become aware of a mother, but also he gives it to us by evolution to make us aware that he exists. Well, then it seems to me that if this module is properly functioning when we produce the belief in God, and it's successfully aimed at truth, then we can know that God exists, even apart from argumentation, right? From our own experience, based off of God guiding the evolutionary process, setting us up in a sort of way to bring us awareness of him. It's like Augustine says, we have a God-shaped hole in our heart, right? And as Jack mentions in his book, and we'll restless until we find rest in him.
Sorry, Tyler, that's time.
Sure. Okay. I'm done anyway. So.
Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah. Let's let. So we're turning now to just open dialogue. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this will be moderated. So if I feel the need to jump in and clarify or move the discussion along, I will. But the hope for me is to stay out and just listen and enjoy. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you guys. But let's let Jack, since Tyler just went for he just did his opening statement. Let's turn it over to Jack, get some thoughts from him, and then hopefully that will spark the dialogue moving forward.
The main comment that springs to mind after hearing your statement is, you say in several places the qualifier, if our cognitive faculties are functioning properly and successfully aimed at truth, I think are the words you used. And again, I just have to say, our cognitive faculties are not successfully aimed at truth. They're not aimed at truth at all. They're aimed at reproductive success. Everything about us, all of our traits, everything evolution has shaped, is aimed at reproductive success. Now, it just happens, fortunately, that what's useful for reproductive success often corresponds with what's true. I think there is an objective reality out there that we humans interact with. I think we agree on that. And natural selection has shaped our minds and our bodies to interact with that reality. And so there is very often a good consonance between our cognitive faculties and truth, truth meaning the objective reality around us, but not always. And that's the critical thing. So you can't make that assumption. You have to scratch that from your line of logical inference.
Yeah, so thanks for that comment. I guess there's a couple things I want to say, if that's okay, and I'll say them and then feel free to respond. Right. So I'm making a just to be clear, as you wisely so, that I'm making a conditional statement when I'm talking about proper functionalism. Right. I'm making an if statement. Um, And so in this case, I'm not declaring that in this case that our cognitive faculties are functioning properly and are aimed at truth. I'm saying that if they are, right? And if by aimed at truth, you could think that even if our cognitive faculties aren't directly aimed at truth, that maybe they're indirectly aimed at truth, right? For evolutionary reasons, as you mentioned. So the question is, right, um, are some of our intuitions at least indirectly aimed at truth, right? Do some of our seemings actually reflect reality? Do they get us to believe? Do our seemings and our faculties act as reliable processes to at least get us to some beliefs that are true? And I think, and obviously correct me for sure if I'm wrong, but I think that you have a Huffington Post article, and I think you say, at least how I read you. You know, I want to preface this. I don't want to misinterpret you. How I read you was saying that some of our intuitions or seemings aren't going to get us to truth, but some of them do, and we can verify or validate them through scientific observation. And so, because if that's not the case, then if we through a phenomenological introspection, I think plausibly belief in other minds comes, and it's sort of through this immediate cognitive system one process, memory beliefs, a lot of them too. And so if we're just going to throw out all of system one intuitions or thinking process, I think we'll be in trouble for that reason. And then finally, when we're talking about best explanation of a theory, and if one thought maybe we can only trust what can be shown by the scientific method and best explanation or some sort of Bayesian analysis, right? Well, if God has not guided our cognitive faculties, and our cognitive faculties have come about purely through random mutation, not guided by God, then why trust them when it comes to higher order reflective cognitive system 2 type thinking? Usually when we're talking about theorizing and best explanations, we're going to assume some sort of intuitive criteria that we utilize to tell if one hypothesis is better or superior over competing hypotheses. But why I think we've evolved in such a right way where we're going to actually reliably get to the right criteria that's utilized in determining whether or not a hypothesis is actually better than not. So just to summarize and let you respond. First, I said, from your own work, I think you would say that sometimes our seemings and intuitions get us to truth. And then secondly, I said that if not, it seems like we're going to be in trouble regarding, say, belief in other minds and memory beliefs. And then finally, third, I mentioned that here's a worry. If our faculties are not aimed at truth, if our intuition, we can't trust our intuitions, why even trust them when it comes to complex reasoning? So anyway, I'll let you. I'll pipe down now.
Okay, there's several good points there. First, I guess I could clarify what I was trying to say in that Huffington Post article, the part that you were citing. As I just said in my previous comment, our intuitions do sometimes align with truth, but they are never aimed at truth. They are always aimed at reproductive success. And the main point I made in the Huffington Post was to say that intuition is not intrinsically a bad thing. When I was arguing in that article, how do we perceive reality? How do we come to understand reality? How can we know what's real? And I was arguing for a scientific worldview and saying that you really do need what we're calling system 2, the slow, analytical, logical, scientific, evidence-based approach to reality, to answering questions, to get at the truth. And that does not come naturally to people. That takes effort, it takes training, and it's slow and effortful. The intuition comes spontaneously, unconsciously, rapidly, naturally. And it's not a good truth-finding mechanism, but it is good for reproductive success. And the examples I used in that article were things like questions like, well, what should I have for dinner tonight? Or should I marry my girlfriend? These are questions that are subtle, they're complicated, and to try to answer, should I marry my current girlfriend? That involves so many things. It's such a complex question. And it's a decision you have to make based on incomplete information. There's a lot you don't yet know about your current girlfriend. Maybe you haven't been dating as long as you should before making this decision. Or maybe there are things about her that she hasn't revealed yet. How compatible are you? You can't sit down and write out a list and go through a bunch of logical deduction and come up with, or write a computer program to try to solve that problem. We normally reach a decision like that based on intuition, on gut feelings that, gosh, I just love every minute I spend with her. She has a great sense of humor. She's beautiful, but I can't get enough of time with her. I think I could really live the rest of my life with her. And if you have, intuitions like that, they are useful. They can help you make the right decision in something that is otherwise so complex, it's hopeless. So intuition is a good thing, but it's good because it helps us with decisions that affect reproductive success. Now, I'm trying to think I've lost a little bit of my train of thought about what else you said, what other points you made there. Maybe you could refresh my memory on the rest of your comment.
Right. So it seems like belief in other minds is informed largely through cognitive system 1. And so we shouldn't jettison cognitive system 1 completely, right? Because then we might be introducing a lot of skepticism and so forth. So I think that was the second response.
Okay, that is a great point. And I should say that intuition also is very useful in science. Scientists use it all the time. But they don't use it to decide what's true or false. They use intuition mainly to come up with suggestions for what might be true or false. They come up with, or what kind of experiment could best get at answering this question, or even on a broader level. What should, okay, I've written the scientific paper, I've studied that problem. What do I do next? What interests me the most? Where would my skills have the most hope of teasing out one of nature's secrets? Now that again is like deciding who should I marry. It's so complex that you can't easily do it by reasoning. It has to come from gut feelings, I think. And scientists use intuition for stuff like that all the time. But maybe I should back up a little bit and say a few things about the scientific worldview, because we don't really in science ever really know anything. We don't have absolute knowledge or absolute certainty of anything. We tend to think of knowledge as a probabilistic thing, and we think of knowledge as being in proportion to the evidence we have. So knowing is not all or nothing for scientists. Knowing is a continuous thing that is proportional to the amount of evidence you have that bears on the question. And we mostly are interested in really what we try to do is not to prove something, not to prove a hypothesis, but to disprove alternative hypotheses, where the scientific experiments are really aimed at disproving something. And what you try to do is you try to think of as many alternate explanations as you can come up with for some phenomenon, like the feeling of a presence that just comes to you in the middle of the night or in some moment of crisis. You try to think of as many possible explanations for that as you can. And then you try to think of what kind of experiments could, in principle at least, or preferably in practice, disprove each one of them. And then you go and do the experiments. And as you disprove each one, you scratch that off the list. And if there's one that makes testable predictions, then you do the experiment and the test passes. It actually does turn out the way you predict it would. Then that's the one you have confidence in. And the more of those experiments you do, the higher your confidence becomes. So again, I would say that in science, we don't throw out intuition, but we never use it for the final decision about belief or degree of belief or likelihood of a hypothesis being true. We always end up using system 2 for that.
Okay. May I respond, or are you finished? Or
Oh, sure. Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay, great. I just didn't want to interrupt you. Didn't want to be that guy. So a couple things. I figure one, we could maybe get more precisely what we mean by intuitions, right? I think that might be helpful.
Okay.
And so you might think that an intuition just is a disposition to believe a proposition, or you might think that an intuition is some sort of mental state or some sort of event that leads you to see something is true or think that something is true, right? So that's what I mean by intuitions here. And so with regard to this, it seems to me that the scientist always has to use intuitions. And some of the intuitions he uses can't really be verified by science, or he doesn't actually do experiments to see whether or not the intuition can be verified. For example, again, going back to cognitive system 1, belief in other minds, belief that other minds exist, right, as you like to put it. Again, like this plausibly is formed by cognitive system 1, or at least cognitive system 1 has like a large role to play in this, and that yet scientists just assume that, and they think it's true, and that they go into the science lab with this assumption. And even if you try to say, well, we can justify it through cognitive system 2 or something like that, well, then you're going to run into some problems with skepticism, right? Like, how do you know you're not a Boltzmann brain that just didn't pop into existence a few seconds ago, right? Or how do you know you're not a brain in a vat, or a Cartesian demon monster is tricking you right now, or perhaps you are an immaterial soul that just came into existence a couple seconds ago with the experience and memories? Science obviously is not going to be able to tell us, I think, much about this, especially if we're utilizing Bayesian reasoning and understanding intrinsic probability to be a primary source, which is determined by simplicity, and these hypotheses are simpler. So I do want to kind of make that point. Secondly, so I guess long story short, it still seems to me that we need to reconcile how belief in other minds is justified. And if cognitive system 1 is primarily responsible for it, and if we think that it's good, it gets us to truth about other minds, then that we should kind of concede that, at least as some information that we can engage with. Secondly, I wouldn't want to say that science doesn't give us knowledge, right? We can know things. So if knowledge just is something like warranted true belief, we can know things, right? We can know that there's gravity, or we can know that some sort of roughly a neo-Darwinian evolutionary picture is true, right? Depiction of the world is true. Now you're right. We don't have absolute certainty, right? We could just be a Boltzmann brain, right? That's a possibility, but nonetheless, it's still enough to be able to say no. So in the same way, when I'm talking about God or I'm talking about intuitions, I'm not talking about absolute certainty, right? And so I did want to make that point. And then the final point I wanted to make was just kind of hitting a little bit more on the third point I made earlier, which is when we're talking about competing hypotheses. In order to justify one hypothesis over and above other hypotheses, we have to we have to have some sort of kind of robust imagination. Tom Chris makes this point. We have to have some sort of robust imagination to where we can actually come up with relevant alternative hypotheses, right? Ones that are relevant. And it's just kind of like, why think that natural selection has guided us to have relevant or a big enough imagination to come up with the sort of relevant hypotheses that we can compare and contrast with the hypothesis that's in question. And why think that we are hardwired in such a way where we're actually intuitively getting the criteria of best explanation, like simplicity, ad hocness, right, plausibility, explanatory scope of a hypothesis, right? Why think that we're actually getting to the right sort of criteria when it comes to being able to do best explanation comparison, given that our cognitive faculties have come about just purely through genetic random mutation?
Okay. Well, first of all, I should say that I don't think, and I don't think any biologist would say that our cognitive faculties come about through random genetic mutation. Evolution is not a random
Winnowed
process.
by natural selection.
Yeah, there you go. That's the
Yeah.
important point. Mutation is random. Evolution is not. Evolution is a highly non-random process. And it's natural selection that makes it highly non-random. So let's make sure we're clear about that.
But by randomness, I just mean there's no physical mechanism inside the creature or outside the creature that's dictating the next mutation. That's how kind of some standard biologists say it. I just want to be clear.
Yeah, that is correct, yes. Excuse me. The point about you raised a very interesting point about the Boltzmann brain or the brain in a vat. These are not these are not hypotheses, and of course, science cannot disprove these things. It's possible I am a brain in a vat, and you don't even exist. It's
Right.
possible this computer in front of me doesn't even exist, and I could never know that. It's all. And another one you mentioned is in another discussion you had with Cameron some time ago, was the idea that the entire universe was created 5 minutes ago.
Right.
And it just has the appearance. It's artificially been given the appearance of age, and we've been endowed with false memories and so on. You can't disprove that. It could be true. The problem with ideas like that is that they are untestable. There is no experiment that could prove any of them false. They're not falsifiable. And there are infinitely many of them that a creative mind could come up with. There's no limit. There's a whole universe of these ideas that a fanciful human imagination could come up with that are untestable, could be true. We have no way of distinguishing one from the other, no way of saying that any one of them is any more or less plausible or probable excuse me, than another. So scientists
You might think that you can through simplicity, right? That some of these hypotheses might be simpler than others.
But if there's no way to test them, I say nope. Sorry, I can't. That doesn't cut it for me. If it's completely untestable, that's neither more or less probable. The classic rejoinder to ideas like this comes from Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist, who said, this idea, it's not only that this idea is not correct, it's not even wrong, right? That's the worst put down a scientist can give your idea, or one of these brain in a vat kind of ideas, which is that it's so worthless. Not only is it not true, it isn't even false. It's because it's not testable. It's a scientifically worthless idea. So scientists just ignore that stuff, and we kind of, so when we say that we believe there's an objective reality that we can come to understand through observation and analysis and experimentation and so on. That's an assumption. That's a very
Right.
low level basic assumption, which could be false. We can never
Right.
know. But having made that assumption, we just embark on this journey and start trying to figure out reality by asking questions of reality itself.
Hmm.
And that's the essence of science. You want to know what's real? Go ask the question of reality itself. And it's difficult to do. You have to the wonder of science, one of the great innovations of the scientific method is the idea of isolating some little tiny aspect of reality in a way that eliminates the confounding factors that make it so hard to understand. And if you do that right, do the right controls and so on, you can start winnowing away all these alternative explanations and narrow it down to only one if you're doing well, and that becomes a tentative truth that we build on. So that I hope answers the question you raised. At least those are the thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah, Jack, thanks for that. So in thinking through this, it sounds like what you're saying is that we can't truly know that we're not brains and vats or Boltzmann's brains. Maybe we can't really actually avoid skepticism, but we can make all rational assumptions, maybe call them all rational assumptions. And then from assuming these having these all rational assumptions, we can then kind of say, all right, given this is how the world is, right? Sounds like that's kind of what you're saying. Is that right?
Yeah, if the rational assumption is just the very simple idea that
The external world.
Objective reality exists, and
Okay.
and what we get through our senses is mostly a reflection of that reality. It tells us something about reality. Our senses aren't perfect, as we were just saying, and the way our minds tend to interpret them can be wrong. But by amplifying our senses with scientific instruments, by doing controls to eliminate, for example, the hypothesis that there's an ancient civilization on Mars that's made sculptures of human faces. You can actually test that. You can test that hypothesis. Just look at that part of Mars with higher resolution. And we did that, and we could toss out that hypothesis because at high resolution, the face disappears. So yeah, that's what we do. We
Right.
start with
Well, so it seems to me that like, no, we obviously do know we're not brains and vats. We're not Boltzmann brains. There is an external world. The past wasn't created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age, right? It seems like we can know this. And so there's a theory, and so epistemologists kind of debate. They have this little debate about something called particularism versus methodism. And if you're a particularist, you're going to sort of just assume like obvious cases of knowledge, such as what we're talking about. And then you're going to sort of judge your epistemic theory based on whether or not your theory can account for knowing obvious facts, right? While a Methodist is going to take a different approach. They're going to kind of come up with their theory first, and then they'll use that theory to judge whether or not they know even the obvious truths. And so as an epistemic particularist, it seems to me like, no, obviously we do know these things. And so in here, the two epistemic theories, the popular epistemic theories that I mentioned earlier, phenomenal conservatism, proper functionalism, they give us resources. They can explain how we know these obvious truths. And so this is some good reason to think that, there's something here with these epistemic theories. If your epistemic theory can't explain how we know obvious truths or how animals or infants know obvious truths, then so much for your epistemic theory sort of thing. The second point I wanted to say was I do think through confirmation theory that we can actually confirm whether or not some hypothesis is true, like some skeptical hypothesis, but maybe that you don't take that view. And then thirdly, I just wanted to kind of reiterate again that by our faculties being aimed at truth, again, you can think of that indirectly or directly. So if don't let the aimed at truth part mess you up too much. If all we mean is, because of these evolutionary factors, nonetheless, they end up getting us to truth still, even if that's not the intention or how it was hardwired. And then, so yeah, I'll say those three things and let you see if you need to respond to any of that.
Well, I would still reiterate that we cannot know that we're not brains in vats.
Yeah.
I can't know that.
Accept that position,
And
right?
but I don't take the idea seriously. I reject it because it's
Sure.
untestable. That's not the same as knowing that I'm not a brain in a vat. It's saying I don't know whether I'm a brain in a vat, but I'm not going to waste any time worrying about it because it's
Gotcha.
untestable. Um, and so it is with belief in God too. Actually, when I say I'm an atheist, what I mean is not that I'm confident no God exists. What I mean is I I don't see any evidence of it. I am not persuaded of the idea, so I lack belief in the existence of any God. I could be persuaded of it. Um, and when people ask me sometimes, what would it take to persuade me that God exists? The example I like to use is, well, if a bunch of Christians got together and decided that the attacks of September 11th were a terrible thing that can't possibly be God's will. The God we worship wouldn't have approved of that.
Hmm.
Let's all pray together, as the New Testament says we should, and God will give us what we ask. And what we should ask is that the World Trade Center Twin Towers be miraculously resurrected, that everyone who is killed in those buildings be miraculously resurrected, brought back to life. They suddenly appear, and so they announce they're going to do this. They do the prayers, and lo and behold, it happens. The new building that's been built in its place vanishes, and the old Twin Towers are there. All the dead people we've been mourning all these years are alive again, and in there, and it's astonishing, and it shows up in the news, and we first pinch ourselves to convince ourselves we're not dreaming and so on, and we can go there and visit the place, and television shows are interviewing all these people who've been brought back from the dead. I would have to, if that happened, I would have to say, okay, I'm impressed. Now I have to start taking Christian theology seriously. But that's not the universe we live in. That doesn't happen. Dead people don't come back to life. For that reason, I have to conclude probably Jesus never came back to life. That the stories about Jesus in the New Testament are just that, stories. And I'm more interested now in trying to understand the world the way it really is. And this is what drew me to a scientific worldview.
Yeah. So I'm down with talking about the problem of evil or expectations about what God would or wouldn't do. However, real quick before we, I guess, move on to that, if that's where you want to go, I'm curious. Would you would you say that you can agree? And maybe you can't, but if it happened that our cognitive modules say this, impart these neural indicators or whatnot that lead us to believe that there's a mother. It also lead us to there's a God. If God existed, and He designed us in such a way, so no something. If God exists, let's assume for our sake of argument, God exists, and He's like, I want them to know about me, and so I'm gonna give them these sorts of cognitive modules. Yeah, it'll let them know about other minds or a mother. Also, it's going to lead them in a lot of instances to believe in me as well. And so he through the process of natural selection brings about our minds to be like this. And most people in the world obviously believe in God or something like God. And maybe this is part of a big reason, right? If our faculties are functioning properly and aimed at truth, then in these circumstances, do you think that we could know that God exists or have rational faith or rational belief, something like that? If that is how the world actually is, if God does exist and He set us up cognitively in that sort of way?
No, because well, I'll put it to you. I'll try to answer you by asking you a question.
Okay.
First, I'll say that the scenario or the scenario, whatever that you just painted, the image you just painted of a possible reality could be true. The hypothesis I offer about where these feelings of God's presence come from is, it's a completely natural hypothesis. You don't need for there to be a God for any of this to happen. It completely, I think,
Right,
explains how
right.
people come to these feelings in a completely naturalistic way, where the existence of God doesn't enter in at all. But it could be true, even
Hmm.
so, that there is a God, and he
Right,
did exactly what you just said. He
right,
he
right.
he he tinkered, he tweaked with evolution as it was happening
Yeah,
to to give us this innate model of the mother
right.
that not only improves attachment between mother and infant during early infancy, but also persists into adulthood and gives us this illusion of God's presence, which in this scenario is not an illusion. It's an apprehension that God wanted us to have to feel his presence. Okay, so that's possible. Now, the question I have for you is,
Mm,
how would you disprove that hypothesis? How would you
mm.
disprove the idea that that God is there and God
Right,
did this?
right, right. Yeah, no, good question. So seems to me, so on, just to kind of clarify, what I've argued for is that religious belief can be justified or warranted based off of these experiences in the case that if God hardwired us in this way, if he existed and did hardwire on this in this way. And it seems like both of us, unless I've misunderstood you, are inclined to think that if this actually did occur, then we could have rational belief based off of these modules. Um, Now, it seems to me that what you're hinting or what you're getting to is what Plantinga, the philosopher Alvin Plantinga, talks about the difference between the de jure objection and the de facto objection, right? And how they end up the de jure objection ends up depending on the de facto objection. And so, you might hear like a typical objection, something like, even if God does exist, we could never know it, right? Call this the de jure objection. And the de facto objection says, no, God doesn't exist. Here's why. Well, it seems like what I've offered is a response to the de jure objection, saying, no, if God does exist, we could know it. Here's how, right? Using Jack's own work. I'll explain how. Um, and then the question is, all right, but to show that that's not the case, right, we actually have to end up getting into the de facto objection, right? In order to then mount a successful de jure objection, it's going to ultimately depend on the de facto objection. Does God exist? Does God do this, right? And so it seems to me that in order to truly uh, argue that we could know God exists, you're going to end up having to get into the de facto area. And I think that's what you're picking up on. Um, of course, as I'm an analytic philosopher of religion, um, and there's lots of different arguments people make up, right, to try to argue that God doesn't exist. Stuff from the problem of evil, divine hiddenness, logical incoherencies with the very nature of God. Um, you could try to argue that, against particular miracle claims like Jesus' body's over here. um, so, yeah, I mean, I guess that would be the way, right, to convince someone that ultimately God doesn't exist and he hasn't set up the world in this sort of way. You would need to ultimately show that God doesn't exist, and that those are the sort of avenues that you would go in order to show that he doesn't exist. At least I take it that would sort of be kind of like the norm.
Well, I'm not really asking for philosophical arguments.
Okay.
I'm
Oh,
really,
it's a biographical.
I'm really asking for an experiment. Um, for First of all, let me back up a little bit. The hypothesis that I favor, which is that that this faculty exists in for perceiving or expecting the existence of a mother. This exists in the infant brain to facilitate connection with the mother and mother-infant attachment. Um, and I suggest that this persists, this circuitry that does this for the infant
Mm.
persists into adulthood. Now, the reason it persists into adulthood is an interesting question. We can get into that later if you want. Um, but the suggestion I'm making is that there's no good, not necessarily a good reason for it to persist into adulthood. It just does. Now, as I said there, I actually do have some thoughts on that, and I think there may be some good reasons why it persists into adulthood. But let's assume it does. And persisting into adulthood as it does, it gets triggered under circumstances that mimic the helplessness of infancy.
Right.
And under these moments of crisis and helplessness and so on, desperation, it turns on, and you get this vivid sensation that there exists this other being out there. It's a vague, amorphous existence of some being that can save you and loves you and can and will respond to your cries.
Right.
Okay, so that hypothesis is testable. If it's true, or what if it's true, what you would expect is that you would see similarities in patterns of activity in the brains of adults having this kind of mystical experience to those in the brains of infants crying for their mother, for example. And I have a whole chapter near the end of the book laying out a whole bunch of detailed experiments that could be done to try to test this, that all fit sort of that pattern, that general pattern of prediction. What I'm asking for is an empirically testable prediction, a hypothesis, some way you could test the idea that God wanted us he wanted us to have this faculty to perceive his existence, his or her existence, some mystical, divine, supernatural being is also in that circuit. He shaped it to make a mother-shaped hole in the brain of an infant, in the brain of an adult. It just happens to be very useful as a God-shaped hole, which is something he wanted us to have because he wants to fit into that hole for us. He wants it to be easy for us to fit him into that hole. How would you disprove that idea, that last part? How would you do an experiment that could disprove that idea?
Well, using confirmation theory, you might. I mean, again, you might think that that we wouldn't expect the amount of evil, the types of evil that we have in this universe, if on the God hypothesis. And so, I mean, I guess that's one way that you would try to show it. I mean, this is why it ends up turning into the de jure objection turns into de facto objection, right? Arguments against God, if they're successful, would make this sort of approach I'm saying very implausible, not work, right? If we show that God doesn't exist, then obviously this is not a live option. And so I guess that's the sort of approach that I think you could take. I think more pressingly, or more really what's behind this, might be an epistemological commitment that you might hold. And you can, obviously, as always, correct me if I'm wrong. That's almost like, in order to know something, it needs to be such that it can be empirically verified or testable, something like that. But of course, that assumption or thesis isn't empirically testable or can't be empirically verified. And of course, it would make it such that if belief in other minds, or belief that there's uniformity in nature, right? The future will be like the past, which is what science depends on, that assumption. It might lead us to become skeptics because we can't test these sorts of things maybe in the lab in the sort of way that you want to. But I do know you've kind of mentioned that you're fine with that sort of move. But as a particularist, I'm not. That's not a live option for me. And so, yeah, that would be. I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I guess I have to confess it doesn't answer my question in a way that I, as a scientist, find satisfying.
Okay.
I'm really not asking for a proof that God doesn't exist. I'm asking for some way to test the idea that he wants to be plugged into that God-shaped hole, which I say is really just a mother-shaped hole. And the answer I would give is that it's not testable. There's no way to test that. I cannot think of any experiment to do that. If you can, I'd love to hear it, but I haven't heard it yet. And I'm talking about something that we could measure, something that's like activity in the brain or something, or responses to drugs or whatever. I don't see it. I don't see how that's possible. And so, to my way of thinking, this idea that God wants us to plug him into this mother-shaped hole is in the same category as all of the other ones that we were talking about earlier, the brain in the vat, the universe was created 5 minutes ago. Any one of those could be true, but we have no way of distinguishing one from the other. We have no experimental tests we could do on any of them. There's no way to assign any kind of
external world
probability.
exists. Same thing.
Yeah, right. Right. So I have to say, it's not only do I think it's not right, I think it's not even wrong. It's untestable.
Right.
It's scientifically, it doesn't lead to, it's an intellectual dead end. It doesn't lead to any testable experiments. It's just a dead end. And it's the kind of thing we have done as a species for as long as humans have existed. We do this with everything we don't understand. We see lightning and thunder, and we assume the gods are angry, or it's Thor's hammer. The crops are failing. People are starving. We're in a drought. We better go sacrifice another virgin to the gods to make sure we get some rain. We always plug agency and supernatural agency in particular to try to give us some kind of grasp, some kind of grasp on reality, some kind of understanding, some way we can make sense of this strange reality we find ourselves in. That's the short name for that, of course, is the God of the gaps. And we've always done this, but only over the last few hundred years, the God of the gaps has been shrinking. We've gradually, as science has gradually come to grips with reality through the scientific method, as we've gradually built up an understanding of physics and chemistry and biology, we have gradually whittled away at the God of the gaps. He's retreated from all of these places where he used to live, and so much so that no educated person today seriously believes that thunder and lightning come from Thor's hammer. We're past that now. We're done with that. And yet, the God of the gaps hides still in a few places that we don't fully understand through the methods of science. And the human brain is certainly one of those last strongholds for the God of the gaps. And in particular, this mysterious feeling that comes to people, this apprehension of God's presence, this feeling of God's presence, and the sense of certainty that there exists this vague, amorphous other being, that comes to people, and it's very easy, even for scientists, to plug the God of the gaps into that place. And very distinguished scientists have done this. The one I like to quote is Francis Collins, who's a brilliant scientist. I admire him greatly. I wish I could be a tenth the scientist he is. He deserves all of the praise and awards he has, and yet he has been seduced by this, what I call a cognitively impenetrable illusion of God's presence. He has had it. He's had that experience himself, and if you read his book, The Language of God, I think is the title. That's one of his what I see as his two main arguments for the existence of God, this feeling of God's presence. And he uses the phrase you used, if we have a God-shaped vacuum in our hearts and minds, why do we have a God-shaped vacuum in our hearts and minds unless it is meant to be filled? Right. And he offers that rhetorical question as his evidence for God's existence. And I have tried to give a serious, non-rhetorical answer to his question.
Right. Yeah, so a lot to respond there. Thanks for all that. And so I guess just to reiterate a couple of the points and then make a new point. So it seems to me that you're endorsing some sort of uh, scientism where unless it can be verified through the sciences empirically, then we shouldn't count it as knowledge, something like that. But of course, again, that thesis can't be verified by the empirical sciences and therefore shouldn't count as knowledge. Um, Secondly, the sort of epistemic theories that I've already advocated for don't have this requirement. And so totally cool with saying that even if we're not able to test in the way you want to test for a hypothesis, nonetheless, we could still have rational belief without it. Thirdly, wanted to say that, again, I think that you could try to prove that that's not what's going on here by showing that God doesn't exist. So I'm a little not sure exactly why what I've talked about utilizing evil and confirmation theory, why that might not be relevant to showing that God doesn't exist and isn't intending us to believe in him through this sort of way. Obviously, if Christianity is true, and this sort of God that Christianity talks about, right? The God of the Sermon on the Mount, then you might just infer, like, yeah, well, God probably would do this, right? If he did exist. And like I said, it ends up turning the de jure objection ends up going into the de facto objection. But finally, you've hit on this a couple times with religion being religion or God of the gaps. People thinking that maybe this agency detection device within us, or the modules of attachment that you've mentioned, maybe they've given us false positives in the past about gods or something like that, right? Thor's hammer. And so we maybe shouldn't trust it or something like that. It's not reliable, right? If that's what you're getting at, I have sort of a couple of responses I've given in the literature on this. And that is, well, our faculties might not be, they're obviously reliable in some sense, right? Our hyperagency detection device is reliable in the sense that it gets us to believe that agents are around us all the time, right? There might be certain circumstances you think that they're not reliable, maybe in circumstances where the agent isn't visible or something like that. And of course, this gets into a whole epistemic generality problem. But the idea is that nonetheless, our faculties, our modules involved in getting us to believe in divinity or supernatural would be reliable if supernaturalism is true. Again, if supernaturalism is true, and these faculties are getting us to broadly believe that the supernaturalism exists, that the divinity exists, then our faculties would at least be broadly reliable. They might not be narrowly reliable, where they're producing the belief that Thor did this, right? The god of thunder did this, right? But nonetheless, they would still be broadly reliable insofar as it's getting most people to believe in the correct thing, which is supernaturalism or theism is true. And then we might use science, and we might use philosophy, and we might use social cooperation to then kind of more finely get at what is there, what is divinity. But as a proper functionalist, you might even think that as long as you just find yourself still believing that, I don't know, Jesus rose from the dead bodily, and that is the result of properly functioning faculties aimed at truth, even upon reflecting about, some unreliability issues, some narrow unreliability issues in the past, well, then your belief could still possess warrant if you hold to it firmly enough. And then, of course, you might give a circular reason, right? You might give a circular argument, which some circularity is okay, right? There's a difference between benign circularity and vicious circularity. So benign circularity is when you use a circular argument, you're going to utilize an assumption that you really don't question. This seems obvious to you. So, for example, if I say, how do I know my cognitive faculties are reliable? I might use my cognitive faculties to show that they're reliable. That's permissible. It's benign circularity. If I don't seriously question my cognitive faculties, whether or not they're reliable. And so in this case, I might say, well, yeah, I know my cognitive faculties related to producing belief in God are reliable because Catholicism is true or Christianity is true. And if Christianity is true, then God would have guided my cognitive process. If I don't sincerely question whether or not my religious processes are reliable, then that seems to be fair play. So overall, let me summarize, and then I'll turn it back over to you. I hit on kind of your overall epistemology, the sort of scientism, my fear of self-defeat, and that it leads to skepticism, and how my epistemological theories that I've endorsed allow us to have this knowledge, right? And allows animals who obviously can't do science to have knowledge, or infants to have knowledge. So my epistemic theories allow knowledge about these sort of particular instances that we've been discussing without some sort of verification principle. And secondly, the concern about reliability maybe that you had, sort of addressing it by saying that our faculties might not be narrowly reliable, producing specific fine-grained beliefs that are true, but they're broadly reliable in the fact that they're getting us to have the correct belief that supernaturalism, that divinity is, right? Assuming supernaturalism is true. And you might have other ways of arguing to sort of handle unreliability concerns, like benign circular reasoning, or just appealing to a hard, fast externalism. So.
Okay, well, there's a lot there. You started off, you started off by saying that you were worried that I might be taking a scientism approach,
Yeah.
might be espousing scientism, and then you said something along the lines of, or maybe by way of definition of scientism, that it's the idea that we can't know something unless it has been scientifically proved.
Yeah.
Am I getting you right there? Is that sort of what you had in mind?
That's my worry. That's my worry, is that you're assuming something like this here. Yeah.
Okay. What I would say is that again, the object is not that we have to exclude anything that can't be scientifically proved. We can only accept things that are testable. We can only accept propositions or ideas that are testable empirically and that have passed their tests. And the degree to which we can accept or assign likelihood of truth to such a proposition is the degree to which we've done this. The more predictions we've made and tested and that have passed, the better. The more alternative hypotheses there are that have been excluded by testing their predictions and rejecting them because they fail, the more of that we do, the more confident we can become that this idea really is correct. So we approach the belief in correctness asymptotically. We never quite get to truth. We approach truth asymptotically. And the more we can do to test it, and the more it passes the tests, the more we have confidence in it. So if an idea is not testable, it doesn't necessarily mean it's false. But we, as a scientist, we have to just put it aside, put it on a shelf somewhere and say, okay, maybe we can get to that later when our experimental techniques are better. And we can do some tests, or, maybe we need to think more about how it could be tested. Maybe we just haven't come up with the right idea for testing it. But until that time, we shelve it. We don't know whether it's true or not. But there are other things that are in principle, not just in practice, but in principle, untestable. Now, I think that the notions that people have of God are very complex, and some aspects of them are empirically testable and others are not. For example, the belief in a God to whom you can pray for help with some immediate problem in your life, that's empirically testable. If God answers prayer, if you believe in a God who answers prayer, and you pray to that God to see if you can get God to influence something in the physical world, like, for example, the recovery from heart surgery. There was an interesting empirical study done on this back in 2006, I think it was. You get a bunch of people to pray for cardiac patients who are undergoing cardiac surgery, and then you follow how well they do after the surgery. Do they have complications or not? How severe are the complications? And this was done for a large number of subjects. It was a very well done, very well controlled study funded by the Templeton Foundation, if I remember correctly. And there were some people who received intercessory prayer, and there was a control group that did not receive intercessory prayer. There was another group that did receive intercessory prayer, but was not told that they were getting intercessory prayer. Turned out that the prediction is, if God is responding to prayers in this way, the prediction is that the people who are getting intercessory prayer will have better outcomes after the surgery than those who didn't. But that's not what the result was. The result was no effect whatsoever, no statistically significant difference among these groups, except that there was one statistically significant difference, and that was between the group that was told they were getting intercessory prayer and the group that got the prayer but was not told. And in that case, the people who were told they were getting intercessory prayer did a little bit worse in their outcomes than the other group. So make of that what you will, but the hypothesis fails, right? This aspect of religion was testable, the test was done, and it failed. Now, there are other aspects, though, that I would argue are untestable. And I think this idea that God directed and tweaked evolution to give us this mother-shaped hole for the purpose of later fitting himself into that mother-shaped hole when we're adults, I would argue that that is empirically not testable. And I'm just saying it's I think in principle, not just in practice, not just because we don't yet have good enough fMRI machines or whatever. I would argue that in practice, in principle, there's no way to test that. I put that in the same category as, the universe was created 5 minutes ago.
Great, thank you. So I guess now, should we do our 3 minutes closing statements? Cameron?
Yeah, what I was thinking is, because we got like a minute to go. So what I was thinking was we could, if you guys are both okay with it, let's go ahead and do that. Some closing statements, both sides, about 3 minutes long. I can time them, and then we'll go to some Q&A with the audience.
Okay. Since I go first, let me get my timer out so I don't go over time. All right, Jack, thanks again for having this discussion. I really enjoyed reading some of your work, and very clear and really a good writer. So thanks very much. Again, my sort of worry here, what's undermining some of this, or what's at the heart of some of this, is I think you're endorsing some sort of scientism, verificationism, and where we can't be rational in a belief unless we can empirically test it or prove it, something like this. But that's a principle, right? That it's not rational to believe something unless you can test it. That's a principle that can't be verified through the empirical sciences, at least in the way I think that you're talking about, like in a laboratory, finding some sort of prediction and whatnot. So, and it leads to skepticism, which I guess you're more okay with than me, but as a particularist, I'm like, no, I got to avoid skepticism. It's obviously false. And so my epistemic theories obviously aren't self-defeating. They allow us to talk about how we know that other minds exist, that the future will be like the past, that the world wasn't created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age. And so, my epistemic theories, they don't have this issue. And according to my epistemic theories, I can use these epistemic theories to also suggest that I can know that God exists if I'm been hardwired to believe in him and my faculties are functioning properly, etc. The more I think, the more I read on CSR, even reading your work, the more I just like praise God. I get really excited when I when I read it, because it just seems it excites me to see the mechanism that God uses to lead people to believe in Him. And I think the belief in God is natural to us, is part of who we are as human beings, as rational animals, or religious animals. And I think it's worked quite successfully. I mean, most people in the world believe in God or something like God, and those who don't oftentimes are in, say, a communist country, and there might be social reasons for that. My faith is sort of strengthened. I argued that if God exists and He's used certain cognitive modules, maybe attachment modules, or had or theories of mind to bring about awareness of His existence. If God does exist and He's brought about awareness of Him through these modules that are functioning properly and aimed at truth, then we can know that God exists, even apart from argument. I've argued that the sort of epistemology that I think is being expressed by you has a lot of worries about skepticism and self-defeat. And I've also answered worries that maybe our hat is just not reliable, and in which case I made that distinction between broad reliability and narrow reliability. Okay, my time is done.
All right, thanks, Tyler. And now let's move to Jack's closing statements, about 3 minutes, like we said. And whenever you're ready, I'll start my timer.
Okay, yeah, sure. First, I want to thank both Cameron and Tyler for doing this. I'm grateful for the invitation. I rarely, in fact, this is probably the first time, come to think of it, been invited to speak to a group that is Christian in its orientation, or religious in its orientation. I normally speak to other free thinkers, and it's a pleasure to be able to talk to religious people. I get to talk to religious folks in Facebook and places like that, and it's very unsatisfying. This has been much better. So thank you very much. I'd like to, one of the things I've always imagined doing when I talk to religious believers, I'm assuming your audience is mostly Christian. I don't know that for sure, but for those who are, if you listen to a talk like this, where you're hearing from an atheist, someone who's skeptical of your religious belief, you have to. I would give you some warnings and some advice, I guess, suggestions. If your faith is the foundation of your happiness in life, if you were rescued, if you were saved from drug addiction, let's say, or some other horrible condition by your faith, or if the happiness of your marriage depends on your faith, then you might be better off just not listening to someone like me. But if you care about truth, if you want to know what's real, then you might want to consider the scientific method, the scientific approach to reality. It's and people who do that, people who are religious and start down this path to empiricism and scientific thinking, often they sort of get there without trying to or wanting to even necessarily. But when you get down that path a certain distance, you can't stop. If you're going that way, I can only suggest, or if you're sort of thinking of it, wanting, unsatisfied in some way with religion, try watching the movie The Truman Show. That's a good place to start. It's very short, very entertaining. I think it's a beautiful allegory of deconversion. Another book I would recommend is David Madison's book. It's a short book, easy to read, called 10 Things Christians Wish Jesus Hadn't Taught. Fascinating book. It takes the assumption that everything in the New Testament that's attributed to Jesus was actually something Jesus said. And it analyzes that. There's some really surprising stuff in there. I recommend it. And then if you're wondering why you still believe in God, or if you've lost your belief in God, but you're starting to wonder where this feeling of God's presence comes from, then you can read my books.
All right, now we're going to do some Q&A with the audience, and I've got about 4 questions pulled up so far, but if you have a question for either Tyler or for Jack, then leave it in the live chat. I'll do my best to keep an eye on it as we go along. if you'd like to send a question as a super chat, that's a way to sort of guarantee that your question gets asked today. Otherwise, we'll just go through sort of in order the questions that get sent in. So let's start with the first question.
Can I say something real quick too, Cameron?
Yeah.
If it's possible, I'm to say this. Sorry, this is kind of presumptuous of me, but I was just going to say I'm open to answering all sorts of questions, not just questions related to our discussion, but questions related to theism, atheism, problem of evil. I know we mentioned that earlier. We didn't really get to touch on it. So I'm open to answering any sort of questions that are relevant to God and atheism.
Cool. All right, this one's from Mr. Matt. We'll start with his. He says, for Dr. John, would you say that it is rational to believe in the existence of other minds, consciousness, and moral facts, even if they cannot be explained empirically?
In the existence of other minds, yes, I would say so. Well, I would put that in the foundation of the scientific worldview that I mentioned earlier, which is that an objective reality exists. Okay, that's something we cannot verify. We cannot test it empirically. It's an assumption that science makes, and then we go from there. And so far, it's worked out really well, right? The cosmos has an order. When we probe it, we get regularities and insights and mathematical laws that describe very precisely how physical objects move, for example. So science works, and that gives us confidence to keep at it. Okay, it never proves that the objective reality we're studying really exists. We could still be brains in vats, but we don't waste any time worrying about that. And I don't waste any time worrying that other minds exist or don't exist. I just assume, that objective reality exists. What we can apprehend through our senses includes other human beings, other animals that have different kinds of minds, different qualities of mind and brain. And it's all very fascinating and all very worth exploring. So your question also asks, existence of other mind, consciousness, and moral facts, even if they cannot be empirically explained. As for moral facts, I would say morality is a very high order thing that has to do with social behavior. Morality really, I think, is something that appears, that emerges in the brains and minds of highly social animals like us, who depend upon moral intuition to make our extremely high degree of sociality work. Unlike ants and termites, who make their sociality work at an extremely high degree of complexity through chemical pheromones and instinct, we do it through moral intuition. And there are some things that are morally good and praiseworthy, like making a sacrifice for the good of the group, being kind and cooperating with other people in your group, also being outraged when other people cheat and don't cooperate with the group. Those kinds of intuitions, I think, are largely innate, and through cultural evolution, we refine them in a way that improves human flourishing and human happiness. Interesting subject in itself. I hope that answers your question. That's kind of the best I can do.
Tyler, did you have anything you wanted to add on that, or would you like to move on to a question for you?
Just real quick. It seems to me, again, being a particularist, I think it's obvious that we know certain things. We know other minds exist. We know that it's objectively wrong to mutilate a child for fun. And again, my epistemic theories are able that I'm endorsing can make sense of this. The last thing I thought about morality, what John was getting at, was kind of like, hey, a lot of moral beliefs are from cognitive system 1, and then we can better refine them through cognitive system 2 process, right?
Yes, that's right.
And so, yeah, I mean, why not also think that that's religious belief as well? That, it's not that our religious beliefs are produced from unreliable faculties. It's more like faculties that are not sort of narrowly reliable, nonetheless broadly reliable, coming from cognitive system 1, and then we can use cognitive system 2 to more refine exactly what's going on. And so that would be kind of my approach to answering the question that was given to Jack. Sorry.
Okay, let's move on to another question. We've got 3 queued up from the same person, but let's move on to one that we got from Kevin, I think earlier on in the show. He says, how would a phenomenal conservatism proponent square the intuition that everything is solid with modern atomic theory? Everything is mostly empty space. Looks like this is a question for Tyler.
Yeah, I guess it would be for me. Right. So again, seemings aren't infallible. There's lots of things that I mentioned earlier, several things that I mentioned earlier, in which our seemings can lead us astray. So I don't think Jack and I aren't in disagreement about that. However, I think that there is more to reality than just physical stuff and what physics can tell us about things. For example, I think souls and colors exist. I look at physics as more like creating sort of a blueprint of reality, but it's not going to tell us everything about a house, right? The blueprint is going to tell us kind of the structure of it, but it's not going to tell us all the details or the objects that will exist in this structure. And so that's kind of the approach I take on that.
All right. Jack, do you have any thoughts, any follow-ups on that before we move on?
The only thing I would say or add to that is that it's a very interesting question. The idea that the solidity of matter seems like an illusion once you know how matter is actually organized, that most of the mass is concentrated into these little tiny nuclei, and the rest of it is mostly empty space, which is true. That is true. But these, there's more to it than that. And if the only reason we know this is true is because of scientific experiments done by physicists who made the particular experiment was a sheet of gold foil or aluminum foil or something, some kind of metal foil that neutrons were shot at, and every once in a while one of them would bounce back, and this was not expected. It showed that most of them went through, but a few would bounce back, and the few that bounced back were the ones that hit the nucleus. So this reveals something very strange and different about the way atoms are structured. But again, it was through amplifying our senses that we could see this deeper reality to the way matter is structured. So in a sense, our cognitive faculties, our perception of reality through our senses is working, even with this strange matter that is mostly empty space but feels solid. It really is solid in a sense, but we can appreciate the subtlety of how it's structured at a deeper, finer level through amplifying our senses.
All right, let's move on to super chat. We got one from Fortunate Talisman. Thank you for your super chat. He says, seems scientism will lead to skepticism of even normal scientific beliefs. And I think this next sentence is distinct from the first thought. So he says, seems like special pleading to just accept these assumptions, but not others. So I take it that this is addressed to Jack.
Well, I have a lot of trouble with scientism. With the whole concept. First of all, the word is defined and used in very different ways, so many different ways that I think it's important to, if you're going to use it at all, you better define it very carefully, because one definition of it is that scientism is basically equivalent with what most philosophers would call naturalism, the idea that the natural world is all there is. We approach it through empiricism and scientific exploration and scientific experiments. And anybody who has that kind of a worldview is practicing scientism. And if that were the definition, and the only definition, I'd happily accept it. But that's not the way most people use the word. I don't think that's the way Tyler's using it. It's instead an idea that people are misapplying or science, or they're taking science someplace it shouldn't go or can't go. My feeling is that scientists in practice never worry about this. We don't worry um, about where are the boundaries? Where can we not send our scientific inquiry? What can we not do experiments on? If we do an experiment on that subject, are we now moving over into scientism? The word never comes up in our discussion. We don't worry about it. We do what our techniques allow us to do. We explore where we can. Um, and we see no limits to where it can go, in principle, as long as we're talking about the natural world, things that are physical and measurable and testable. I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I'm also not sure with the premise of the question either, that if maybe I could, is the question still up? It seems like scientism will lead to skepticism. And by skepticism, I think you mean that we cannot know anything. Tyler, is that what skepticism means here? Maybe you can help me out.
Yeah, I think so. We can't know anything.
Yeah.
That's how I would read it.
Well, he's
Yeah,
saying with respect to normal scientific beliefs. So I don't think he's saying global skepticism. I think he's saying it's just going to lead to skepticism, at least in the case of other scientific beliefs.
Well, I take it maybe he's saying like global skepticism will lead to this local skepticism. Anyway, that's how I read it.
Seems like science. Well, anyway, I guess I'm not sure I can give you a satisfactory answer, except that I'm not even sure scientism is a thing. At least if scientism means taking science someplace it shouldn't go or can't go. If there's something untestable, if this then we don't go there because we can't go there, and maybe we'll never get there. But science goes where the experiments will take us. Science goes where our curiosity takes us. That's kind of all I can say. I'm sorry if that's not adequate.
Yeah, Jack, I just have a clarifying question. Would you say that I'm thinking about the extent of science, like what science can actually investigate? And I mean, I think that maybe I can just give one example. I don't know if string theory would qualify, but like multiverse theories, a lot of them, you can't really empirically verify that like some multiverse hypothesis is true. So you've kind of got to use different types of reasoning to be able to adjudicate the probability of those hypotheses. Would you say that that's just outside the purview of science, or would you say that science can investigate that?
I would say to the best of my understanding of those things, both strings theory and this multiverse idea, I would say that those are currently untestable, and it may be that they turn out to be, in principle, untestable. And in that case, they're not much different or better than the brain in a vat idea.
Yeah.
There
But
are lots of physicists who said that.
Would you call those scientific hypotheses, or would you call it a sort of different hypothesis, like a metaphysical hypothesis? Or
if an idea cannot be tested, in principle, it does not deserve to be called a hypothesis. Okay. So I wouldn't even call it a hypothesis. And by the way, the word theory is normally reserved for some hypothesis that has been tested and passed its tests. So Darwinian evolution is a theory. String theory, although we call it that, is not.
All right, yeah, let's move on to Tyler. So what happened to your lights, first of all?
Yeah, so I think I have to actually get up and change it, just like turned off. Do you want me to do that, or does it matter?
Yeah, just go ahead. Yeah, go ahead and do that, because otherwise it's going to be dark. I mean, we've only got like 10 more minutes of discussion time, but hopefully you can do that and come back in.
All right, sorry about that.
Yeah, go ahead. So share your thoughts on this question. Then, like I mentioned, we have like 3 questions lined up. I don't know that we'll be able to get to all of them, but we'll get to as many as we can, and then we'll close out the show for today.
Yeah. So yeah, if you just take scientism, I mean, this is going to be kind of like a very rough definition. I'm not claiming that this definition is jointly necessary and sufficient to capture all what one means by scientism, but roughly the idea that using science in layman's terms, science is our only way to have knowledge. something like that. It's a sort of endorsing a methodological naturalism. So it's some sort of method. It's an epistemological claim about what resources we have available to figure out whether or not we have knowledge. Something like that is what I had in mind.
Okay, that's an interesting idea. And if I could comment on that just briefly.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't necessarily object to that. I would say, though, that to describe my own view of reality, my own approach to reality, as a personal thing, a personal choice, and I think most scientists would agree with this, my apprehension of reality, the set of things that I choose to believe, the degree to which I believe them, is entirely dependent, entirely determined by the degree to which we can test them empirically and the degree to which they pass those tests. So you could accuse me of practicing scientism because of that. I'm not interested in any untestable, in things that are in principle untestable by the scientific method, because you're talking about things like brains in vats and the world was created 5 minutes ago, or I would claim the idea that God shaped evolution so that we'd have this God-shaped whole. Now, okay, so maybe that's
scientism, right?
Maybe that's scientism. If it is, then I have to plead guilty to it.
No, I was saying
there may be other scientists who have a more expansive view, who are perfectly willing to entertain some of the philosophical criteria you have for accepting ideas as true that are in principle untestable.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think many scientists would do that. We just, we're interested in what we can explore, what we can test. We're interested also in the things we cannot test in practice, but hope to be able to test someday. Yeah. But the things that are in principle untestable really don't interest us very much.
Yeah. Okay. So I was just going to say that scientism, that thesis being not testable in the way that you're wanting. So that's the worry where the self-defeat comes into play. Anyway, that's all I was mentioning from earlier.
All right, let's move on. We just had a super chat come in from Robert, and this may actually take us to the last of the show today. And I do apologize. We have had some other questions come in, but that's just the nature of these shows, as we get these super chats and those take priority. So from Robert, he says, atheists try to explain away, and this is like a completely different topic. It's still related to science, but atheists try to explain away God through scientific belief, but we have a relic like the Shroud of Turin, where science cannot explain how the image got there. Science can only say what it is not. So before I turn this over to Jack to share any thoughts he has about the Shroud of Turin, or Tyler, I did want to mention that I'm actually going to be interviewing an expert on the Shroud of Turin. His name is Father Dalton, Andrew Dalton, and I'll be interviewing him in person in my studio in the beginning of January. So be on the lookout for that to come up sometime in January, and interview with an expert on the Shroud. But Jack, do you have any thoughts on this? Or if not, I mean, it's no big deal.
I have a few thoughts. I'm not an expert on that subject. But just because science cannot explain something doesn't mean it's proof of God's existence, or even should be taken as evidence of God's existence, or in any way strengthens the idea that God exists. What you're doing there, again, is God of the gaps. I can't explain how this image got on this piece of cloth, therefore God is real. And in particular, Jesus is real, and this is his burial cloth. Okay, so there's that objection. But as I recall, and my memory isn't perfect, maybe someone can check this with Google for us, but as I recall, some years ago, and I think it was maybe back in the 80s or 90s, I can't remember exactly when, the Vatican did allow some tiny snippet of the fabric of the Shroud of Turin to be radiocarbon dated. And it dates to the 1300s or something like that. It dates to medieval times. So it cannot be the shroud in which Jesus was buried. And science does show that.
Yeah, go ahead, Tyler,
So
if you've got any thoughts.
I haven't studied the issue very much, so I'm kind of ignorant on whether or not what the details are of this. I did want to address one sort of I guess concern that Jack is bringing up, which is it seems to me that this gets back into the falsification issue that we mentioned earlier, where it seems to me that we can utilize confirmation theory, that we can utilize IBE to argue whether or not something is the best explanation. If it's a miraculous explanation or a natural explanation, and doing so doesn't seem to me to be God of the gaps. But I guess that was the only point I wanted to make.
Okay, so Tyler, do you have time for one more question? We just had a $20 super chat come in. Do you have time?
Hit me.
We'll try to get, okay. This one, it's actually for Jack, but we'll see where we go with it. So Maverick Christian says, if the brain in a vat hypothesis is untestable, we can't tell whether it's true or false, then wouldn't competitors to it, for example, climate change is real as opposed to being an illusion, also be untestable and, quote, not even false?
First of all, I don't see how climate change, the climatology is an alternative to the brain in the vat idea,
or a competitor,
a competitor. I don't understand that, but the idea that climate change is real is very much empirically testable. We know that carbon dioxide absorbs energy in the infrared part of the spectrum. You can do that experiment in a lab. It was done more than 100 years ago. It was the start of our understanding of the role of carbon dioxide in the warming of the Earth. So, there's a raft. There are shelves and shelves of journals in the library that provide abundant empirical evidence that global warming caused by burning fossil fuels, dumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, is real. Okay, that's not up for debate.
So,
Tyler, do you have any thoughts?
Published on the issue of climate change, I'm a firm believer in the orthodox position on climate change. So I don't have any objections to you saying that. But it does seem like that if we don't know that the universe wasn't created 5 seconds ago with the appearance of age, and we don't know other minds exist, right? And we don't know the future will be like the past. If we don't have knowledge about these things, then it seems like that's going to lead us to need to be skeptics about everyday scientific theories that make assumptions about other minds existing and the future being like the past, and that the past wasn't created 5 minutes ago and there is an external world. And I think that's maybe what Maverick Christian is getting at.
So skepticism in the one case is going to entail skepticism in the
right.
sort of related case.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Do you have any follow-up thoughts, Jack, before we close out?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. All right. Well, then let's just leave it there. This was a great conversation today. Jack, I was actually, as I was listening to you guys go back and forth and talk and everything, I got the feeling that it would be fun to do this in person too, just sit around at a table, have a couple drinks, just hang out, talk and chill, talk about religious epistemology. It would just be a lot of fun. So I that's the kind of vibe that I was getting from the show today. So that's really cool. Not every show is like this, where some shows are a little bit more heated and they can get kind of dicey. So this was a great, very cordial exchange. I think it was productive and it was really cool. So appreciate both of you coming on and having a great conversation.
Thank you. I enjoyed it too. Absolutely. It was great.
Jack,
awesome.
It was a pleasure. And thanks, Cameron. Live long and prosper, y'all.
Same to you.
Okay. Well, All right. Well, as we're closing out, let me go ahead and just mention one more time that we are doing a giveaway right now for new patrons. And I should have mentioned earlier that this is not just for new patrons. It's also for existing patrons that upgrade to the relevant tier. So if, say, for example, you're at the $5 tier on Patreon and you upgrade to the $10 tier, then we're going to send you this beanie. We're also going to send you, if you sign up at the $25 amount, we're going to send you this shirt. I'll put it on the screen one more time. By the way, Christianity is true shirt in your size, along with the beanie at the $25 amount. And then if you sign up at the $50 amount, we're going to send you all 3 items, that third item being this custom handmade coffee mug that, get it in focus here, both Brittany and I make by hand each one of these. So if you guys become new patrons or existing patrons, upgrade their patronage, then you're going to be sent these items as a sort of added extra thank you for your support. So thank you guys for tuning in today. This was a lot of fun, and I will see you in the next Capturing Christianity video very soon. So see you guys. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is